Hello everyone, I am Swapnil.
And I am Anisha.
Welcome to the first episode of the second season of DataSpot podcast.
So, Swapnil, did you go through the state budgets?
No, yaar, it takes so much time. I don't go through each and every state budgets. No, I didn't.
I do have some interesting points to discuss today.
Okay.
So, we all know that the central government has budgeted rupees 10 trillion of capex in FY24.
Hmm.
Now the state budget data is also out. Based on the PRS India's report, FY24 capex for 21 states amount to rupees 7 trillion. That means in FY24, we might see total of 17 trillion rupees in capex itself.
Wow, that actually is a huge amount. But total capex of states seems lower than the central government capex in FY24. This might be an exceptional year, but did you know that in FY22, all the states together have spent more than the central government? They spent around 7 trillion rupees on
Right.
capex, which was 17% higher than the central government capex.
Yes, but this is not only restricted to capex alone. Even if we compare the total expenditure without bifurcating between capital and revenue expenditure, then also in FY 2022, states have spent 12% higher than that of the central government.
And I think this is not a post COVID phenomenon, right? Because this has
Yeah.
been happening for almost a decade now. I think prior to 2012, the central government was spending more than the states, with obvious an exception for a few years. You can see in this chart that this shift happened in the financial year 2012. Both central government and state governments spent around 13 trillion rupees each, but states spent 12 billion rupees more than the center. That was an inflection point. And from that year onwards, states have been spending more than the center.
Yes, but that's just the first half of the story. The main point is that not only do states spend more than the central government, but they also spend more on productive sectors compared to the central government. So let us start with the different categories under the revenue expenditures. In FY 2022, the center spends around rupees 500 billion on education, sports, arts and cultural categories. But in case of states, Maharashtra itself has spent around 687 billion, which is 38% more than what the center has spent. So when we combine the states and the central expenditures on this category, we can see that on average, close to 90% is borne by the states. And in case of health, that proportion is 80%. In other categories too, we can see that the states spend more than the center. On the other hand, center spends more on interest payments on the borrowings. Center's borrowing is usually more than the states, and therefore we can see such a difference. The center also spends a lot more on agriculture and rural sectors. This could be because the center has to intervene in the rural markets either for fertilizers or interest subsidy schemes or other initiatives. But for the rest of the categories, state spends a lot more than the center.
Yeah, similar is the case with the capex. The states have spent much more than the central government in almost all sectors. States spent on average 5 times more on urban development and housing. On roads too, it has spent around twice more than the center in the last 2 decades. The center has upper hand only in case of defense and railways, which both come under center's purview. So if we exclude defense and railways, then on average, we could see that 70% of capex is made by states.
There is something interesting happening with the composition of central government capex. In FY10, defense and railways contributed more than 90%. So, it means that the most of the central government capex was concentrated on these two categories. Slowly, this share started declining. In FY19, that is prior to COVID, both combined and contributed slightly more than 60%. So, this means that central government has started spending more on different items such as roads, highways, and agriculture in the recent past. You can see in the chart how the roads and agricultural capex has increased recently. That basically has diversified centers capex spending.
But it is still lower than the states, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this makes me wonder, why don't media or analysts analyze state budgets more? We need a deeper analysis and more coverage to understand where our states are spending. State governments are closer to the general public. Usually they are responsible for implementation of any kind of policy, even if it is financed by the central government. So basically whatever states are spending is going to affect us directly. Therefore it matters how states are spending, and it is more important to understand how our states are arranging their finances, because states are subjected to a lot of restrictions as to how much they can spend over and above their receipts.
And I guess it is always better to have more decentralized mechanism. Apart from this, there is one more thing that creates issue in the state budgets, which is their format. Not all states have the same presentation and format of the budget. So if there is uniformity, then it will become much more easier to analyze them. Also, it would really help if the data for all the state budgets could be collated easily with just a single click.
Oh, the single click might be just too much to ask for, I guess, but at least the governments can try to come up with a uniform format for all the states. And I can see how difficult it would be to collate all the data for states. It is very cumbersome at the moment, but hopefully it will change. And actually, one more thing I would like to talk about, since we are on topic of budgets, that is the credibility of the budgeted estimates. I think there is a lot of scope to improve.
So, like, you are basically talking about budget estimates versus the actuals, right?
Yeah, right. I was looking at the broader data. This, by the way, is regarding central government budgets only. So let's start with gross tax revenue. I think the
Okay.
government's tax revenue targets have been more or less achieved. Out of last 23 years, there were 8 years where the actuals were equal to or more than the budgeted. This means that the government was able to earn revenue as it promised, and in some years even exceeded the target. Then it has missed the target by less than 5 percentage points, which I think is a tolerable deviation, in only 6 years. This means if the government budgeted that it will earn 100 rupees from taxes, then it has earned somewhere between 95 and 100 rupees in those 6 years. So both combined, 8 plus 6, that is 14 years, we could see credible budgeted numbers. So that is almost more than half.
That is really interesting. But did you see the expenditure data? It shows something different. We just look at the total expenditure without considering the nature of revenue or capital expenditure, then we can see that the government has overspent in 12 out of 23 years. So, half of the times the government spends more than it promises, and that is problematic, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. For a layperson, this would sound like the government is so generous because it is spending more than the budget. But we know that it is not the generosity, but an invitation to indebtedness. At the same time, we can see that in 8 years, the government has underspent. So that is also problematic.
Exactly. Expenditure is a very delicate in terms of impact. There has to be a nice balance. If the government spends less, then it can impact the welfare and the economic development. And if it spends more, then again fiscal deficit target would not be achieved.
True. Now, I think we can go to capex, a favorite item for all economists. It shows that out of 23 years, there are 10 years where the government has spent on capex over and above its budgeted estimates. That itself is a good record. Then there are five
Right.
more years where it has spent less than the budgeted, but that shortfall is not more than 5%. That means if the government has said that it will spend 100 rupees on capex, then it has spent somewhere between 95 and 100 rupees in those years. So we can say that both combined, we have 15 years of capex being spent as planned. On average, the government has been successfully spending around 98% of the budgeted estimates. So that balance that you are talking about can be seen in capex, but only in few years.
Yes, data on capex looks promising, but in total we can see that government usually underestimates its expenditure.
Yeah, and also overestimate its receipts. So what
Right.
will be the impact of it on the fiscal deficit?
I think we can analyze fiscal deficit in three ways. First, whether in absolute rupee terms the target has been met or not. Second, the target as a percentage of GDP. And third, has the government followed the fiscal discipline path as per the FRBM Act?
The answer to the last question, I guess, is pretty clear, and that is no. The original target under FRBM Act was 3% for central government and 3% for states. And that target kept on postponing for many, many years. In, I think, FY08, we achieved it. Then in FY19, it was slightly above 3%, but we never achieved 3% target. So analyzing it in the last way was very easy.
Yes. Now let us look at the fiscal deficit targets as a percentage of GDP. From FY04 to FY08, the actual fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP was below the budgeted estimates, which is a good thing. But then came the financial crisis, which made life difficult in the next year. Post that, we have a difficult time abiding by the fiscal deficit targets set in the budget. So you can see clearly in this chart, currently it has moderated after the COVID stimulus, but it is still considered very high. So if we just compare budgeted estimates versus actuals, the target was achieved in 14 years out of 23 years. But if we compare the fiscal deficit in absolute terms, then we have achieved the budgeted fiscal deficit in only 8 years. So that means that the nominal GDP, which is the denominator, was higher than the budgeted target. So this means that nominal GDP growth came to rescue the fiscal deficit targets in most of the years.
Oh, so we can say that because government overestimates its revenue, underestimate its expenditure, we can see a lot of fiscal deficit slippages. But over the last few years, we can definitely say that there has been some improvement, but we can do much better, I guess.
Yes, for sure.
So I guess that's it for this episode. We would love to hear your thoughts on the budget, both states as well as center budgets. If you have some questions, doubts, or anything in general, you can contact us. If you are watching or listening to us on Spotify, then there is a Q&A section. You can note your thoughts there. If you are watching this on YouTube, then you can pen your thoughts down in the comments.
And those watching or listening on any other platform, you can drop us an email or can contact us on social media. You can follow India Data Hub, the producer of this podcast, Ashutosh Datar, the co-founder of India Data Hub, Swapnil and me on the social media. All our contact details are available in the show notes. Follow or subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an update. Also, share this podcast link with your friends and colleagues. We will be back soon with another interesting topics.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.